You're the royal physician at the palace in Madrid, and it's the year 1834. The king has died, but your duty is far from over. You've just been called to the private chambers of the late King Ferdinand II, and the reason is so strange, so unlike anything you've ever faced, that you begin to doubt your own sanity. Standing before you is the Queen Regent, Maria Cristina. Her eyes are full of tears as she gives you a request that sends a chill through your bones. Your hands shake as you step toward the bed where Ferdinand's body rests. Even in death, the man who ruled Spain with fear for 20 years seems to mock you with that familiar, cold expression. But it's not his face that grabs your attention. It's what's hidden under the silk sheets, the very thing that symbolized his rule just as much as his cruelty, his paranoia, and his endless betrayals. An unnatural deformity, a grotesque feature of his anatomy that historians would only speak of in hushed tones, too shocking and taboo to ever appear in official records, but never truly forgotten. Ferdinand VII was known not just for his rule, but for something far more bizarre, his grotesquely large and oddly shaped private part. It was both his greatest embarrassment and, in a twisted way, a source of personal pride. As you begin the delicate task of preserving it, your thoughts drift to the rumors you've overheard over the years in the palace halls. Stories about custom-made cushions, wives screaming in pain, and desperate attempts to produce an heir. Efforts that seemed doomed from the start, thanks to this cruel trick of nature. In that moment, you realize you're not just preserving a piece of flesh. You're preserving a symbol of a reign that was as warped and overblown as the organ itself. Damaging, excessive, and disastrous for nearly everything it touched. Before we go deeper into these long-forgotten stories of pain, survival, and strange royal traditions, if you're someone who enjoys uncovering the hidden sides of history, please hit the like button and subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'm amazed that these old stories can bring us together across time and distance, united by curiosity about the past. To truly understand Ferdinand VII, you have to go back to the beginning. He wasn't cursed by magic or punished by fate. His curse came from blood. For centuries, Spain's royal families, the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, married within their own bloodlines. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces. Over time, this created a genetic disaster. Mental illness, physical deformities, and strange disorders were common outcomes of this inbreeding. Ferdinand was the result of that legacy. He was a living example of royal decay. He was born at El Escorial Palace on October 14, 1784. Ferdinand was the child of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, a couple who were first cousins. Their marriage, like many royal unions of the time, was arranged to keep power within the family. But this came at a cost. The genetic odds were stacked against them from the beginning, and Ferdinand would suffer the consequences in a deeply personal and painful way. As he grew from a boy into a teenager, it became clear that something was very wrong. Nature had played a brutal trick on him, one that would leave a lasting mark on both his body and his legacy. I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request. I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request. One story told of a young noblewoman who locked herself in a bathroom for hours after a failed encounter, refusing to speak to anyone. Despite these disasters, there was pressure, both personal and political, for Ferdinand to produce an heir. Spain needed stability, and a royal baby was seen as the answer. But behind closed doors, it became clear that this goal would be nearly impossible to reach. Special furniture had to be made to accommodate him, modified chairs, custom-designed beds, even padded cushions to reduce the physical discomfort caused by his condition. Physicians tried everything: ointments, stretching exercises, even painful surgical ideas that thankfully were never carried out. Nothing worked. As he grew older, the problem only got worse. Ferdinand's bizarre anatomy became both a state secret and a private obsession. Some say he was tormented by it. Others say he took a strange pride in it, seeing it as a twisted sign of royal superiority. Either way, the impact on his marriages was devastating. He wed 4 times, each union driven more by duty than love, and none of them produced a legitimate heir until much later in life. His wives reportedly suffered in silence, and the court covered up the growing list of failed attempts and personal tragedies. Behind the grand image of power, ceremony, and tradition stood a man isolated by something he never asked for and could never escape. Another doctor was far less delicate in his description. The prince's organ resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at the base, thick as a man's fist at the tip, and long enough to serve. The psychological toll on young Ferdinand was severe. At the time, male beauty, especially among the nobility, was measured by the ideals of classical Greece, where a smaller, proportioned body was considered elegant and refined. In that world, Ferdinand's oversized, misshapen anatomy wasn't something to brag about. It was seen as monstrous. What modern minds might view with envy was, for him, a lifelong source of shame. His childhood was shaped by emotional damage and family dysfunction, the kind that might have broken any ordinary boy, but instead, it helped shape him into a future tyrant. His father, Charles IV, was a soft, indecisive man who cared more about hunting than governing. His mother, Maria Luisa, had a fiery personality and an unhidden appetite for control and for pleasure. Her affair with Manuel de Godoy, who effectively ran Spain at the time, wasn't a secret. It played out. Young Ferdinand grew up in that toxic atmosphere, forced to witness the daily humiliation of his father, the open dominance of Godoy, and the manipulative force of his mother. From an early age, he learned that power was often taken, not earned, that betrayal could live right under your roof, and that trusting others was a weakness. But it was Ferdinand's physical deformity that truly shaped the man he would become. Inside the royal court, whispers about the prince's condition were constant. Servants laughed behind closed doors. Courtiers made sly remarks. Foreign ambassadors sent private reports home describing the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand grew up knowing that people didn't just talk about him, they laughed at him. Not for his politics or personality, but for the most private part of his body. That kind of humiliation doesn't fade, it lingers. And in Ferdinand's case, it festered, turning into deep resentment that he would later take out on an entire country. He began to see mockery in everything, in the formal bows of his subjects, in the polite speeches from his tutors, even in the forced smiles of young noble women presented to him as potential brides. Over time, paranoia crept in, and in truth, He wasn't completely wrong. People really were mocking him, just not always for the reasons he believed. As he entered his teenage years, those closest to him noticed a dark change. His tutors wrote that he was becoming secretive, harsh, and unusually cruel. Servants who made small mistakes were suddenly dismissed or punished in ways that weren't written down. Ferdinand had started using his royal authority to make up for the one thing he couldn't control, his own body. One chilling incident, recorded in the private memoirs of a palace chaplain, revealed just how far that darkness had begun to spread within him. When a young page once accidentally walked in on Ferdinand while he was changing clothes, the reaction was anything but reasonable. Ferdinand didn't just fire the boy, he had him publicly flogged. Then, to drive the message home, he had the boy's entire family exiled from Madrid. The message was brutal, but unmistakable. No one could witness the prince's secret and go unpunished. As Ferdinand reached the age for marriage, the full extent of his anatomical condition became impossible to ignore. The royal physicians, who had long tiptoed around the issue, now had to confront it head-on. One of them, Dr. Francisco Flores, Ferdinand's personal physician, left behind hidden notes never meant for the public. These documents offer a disturbing glimpse into what Ferdinand lived with. His Majesty's member, Dr. Flores wrote, presents a most unusual configuration. The base measures no more than the width of a man's thumb, yet it expands to a circumference that defies natural proportion. The length exceeds that of any recorded human specimen, measuring near to 10 in its natural state, and growing considerably larger when aroused. Most concerning is a pronounced curvature and the presence of additional tissue growths, which appear to serve no biological purpose. It didn't take long for doctors and advisors to understand the consequences. Normal sexual relations would be impossible without major medical help and without serious risk to his future wives. In secret, royal craftsmen were ordered to design what they carefully referred to as marital aids. These included special cushions and customized supports meant to make sex physically possible without causing injury or trauma. But Ferdinand's struggles weren't just physical. The mental and emotional toll was just as serious. He became obsessed with fixing himself. He poured energy and wealth into chasing miracle cures, potions, elixirs, and ancient recipes that promised to reshape his body or boost his fertility. Court alchemists and foreign physicians were brought in quietly, each one offering hope, none delivering results. Ferdinand wasted small fortunes on these so-called cures. He drank powders made from crushed rhinoceros horn, pearls ground into dust, and exotic herbs flown in from distant lands. All were meant to regulate his royal essence, as his advisors politely put it. But nothing worked, and each failure only deepened his desperation. As the years went by and the hoped-for heir remained just that, a hope, pressure from the Spanish court grew more intense. Ferdinand's body was now not just a private burden, but a national crisis. He was expected to secure the Bourbon line and bring political stability to a deeply divided country. But behind the palace walls, reality looked very different. Each new attempt at marriage ended in quiet failure. His first wife, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples, was young, devoted, and eager to fulfill her royal duty. But their union was marked by difficulty from the start. Doctors were discreet, But insiders knew the truth. The marriage was never physically consummated in any normal sense. Within a few years, Maria Antonia fell gravely ill. She died at age 21, with rumors swirling that her death was linked to repeated, traumatic attempts at intimacy. Her final months were spent in isolation, and no one dared speak openly of the cause. Ferdinand would marry 3 more times. Each marriage brought renewed hopes for an heir, and each ended in heartbreak and scandal. The court physicians continued their efforts, adjusting the marital aids, prescribing new treatments, even exploring early forms of hormone therapy. But nothing could undo what nature had done. And yet, through it all, Ferdinand refused to give up. He saw his failure to produce an heir not just as a political problem, but as a personal humiliation. His obsession grew darker. He demanded new remedies, harsher treatments, and more radical solutions. At one point, he even allowed a French surgeon to perform a dangerous procedure designed to relieve pressure and improve function. The operation failed and left him in pain for months. Still, he pressed on. He had convinced himself that the future of Spain rested entirely on his ability to reproduce, and he was willing to try anything, no matter how extreme, to make that happen. But with every failure, Ferdinand became colder, more distant, more controlling. What began as private suffering now bled into his public life. The king, who once wanted nothing more than to be a father, was slowly becoming something else. A bitter, isolated man who saw enemies everywhere and trusted no one. Some of the potions Ferdinand tried were meant to shrink his organ to a more manageable size. Others promised to increase his virility, even with its abnormal shape. None of them worked. But Ferdinand's growing desperation made him easy prey for con artists and quacks. They offered him hope in bottles, expensive promises with no results, and he kept falling for it again and again. In 1802, Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The marriage had been arranged when both were still in their teens. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid full of dreams and romantic ideas about her future husband. She'd heard people call him El Deseado, the Desired One, a nickname given by some of his political supporters. In her mind, she was about to marry a storybook prince. The wedding was as grand as expected for a union between 2 royal houses. The cathedral echoed with music. The streets of Madrid were filled with cheering crowds, and the young couple looked like a perfect royal match. Maria Antonia was beautiful, smart, and genuinely excited to start her life with Ferdinand. And in public, he played the part well. He was polite, charming, and acted like any loving young husband would. But royal weddings always end, and wedding nights always begin. And that's when the first signs of trouble appeared. At first night, something went terribly wrong. What exactly happened behind closed doors was never officially recorded, but the aftermath spoke volumes. Servants reported hearing raised voices, muffled sobs, and the sounds of furniture being moved. Maria Antonia did not emerge from her chambers the next morning with the usual glow of a new bride. Instead, she looked pale, shaken, and withdrawn. In the days that followed, her mood darkened further. She stopped smiling. She avoided physical contact. Eventually, she refused to speak about what had happened at all. Ferdinand, for his part, became cold and distant. He avoided her during the day and stalked the halls at night. It soon became clear to everyone at court that something in the marriage had gone terribly wrong. But no one dared speak the truth out loud. Behind closed doors, attempts at intimacy reportedly continued, but with no success. Doctors were summoned. Cushions and devices were adjusted. Herbal remedies were tried. Nothing worked. And the damage wasn't just physical. Maria Antonia, once bright and full of life, became anxious and withdrawn. Her health began to decline. Rumors swirled that she had suffered internal injuries, though no official report ever confirmed it. She died in 1806, just 4 years after the wedding. Officially, the cause was tuberculosis, but many believed her true illness had no name. It was the result of a life spent trapped in a marriage that looked royal on the outside, but was filled with pain, silence, and humiliation behind the scenes. Her death devastated no one more than Ferdinand, but not in the way one might expect. He didn't mourn her as a lost partner. He saw her death as yet another blow to his pride, another failure of his cursed body. And with that, his bitterness deepened. Before the wedding night, something strange happened. Ferdinand's personal valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with a quiet but urgent request. The royal bedchamber, he said, needed special preparations. At first, the ladies were confused. What kind of equipment did a wedding night require? Custom-made cushions were brought in. Bottles of oils and thick salves arrived, along with strange instruments that looked more suited to a medical clinic than a honeymoon suite. The valet assured them all of it was perfectly normal for royal couples, but none of the women believed that. Maria Antonia, like most royal brides of her time, was completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Her education had been strict and religieuse. She was well versed in languages, music, and how to behave in a court, but knew almost nothing about sex. The basics had been whispered to her in vague terms by nervous older women, who themselves had little idea of what she was about to face. No one had warned her about what made her new husband so different. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber and began to undress, Maria Antonia got her first look at what her husband had been hiding, and she panicked. One of her ladies-in-waiting, writing years later in a private memoir, described the scene. Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself. She backed into the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster! Monster!" We felt she had gone mad. Ferdinand's organ, described by witnesses as resembling a great club with a thin handle, was beyond anything the young princess could have imagined. Its size alone was terrifying, but it was the shape that truly shattered her. It wasn't just large, it curved unnaturally, twisted at strange angles, and had odd tissue growths that gave it a deformed, almost alien appearance. For Maria Antonia, it wasn't just shocking, it was traumatic. What followed that night was not a romantic moment between husband and wife. It was something closer to a medical consultation. Ferdinand's private physicians had to be summoned to the chamber to explain, clinically and gently, what would be required of the princess in order to fulfill her duties as queen. The doctors tried to calm Maria Antonia, explaining that with the help of cushions, oils, and carefully timed positioning, Ferdinand's organ, describé par witness as ressemblant à un grand club avec une peine fac, was de bon quelque chose chagrin que le petite mère. Sa taille seulement était terrifiante, mais c'était la forme qui a plu, s'acharner. Elle tournait inappropriée, et ses étangles, produits déformés, presque alignés. Ferdinand's organ, décrit par Witness avec une peine feinte, was de bon quelque chose terrible. Seulement, elle était déformée. Ok, si vous parlez de poiquet, vous ne parlez pas de ponction. Mais ponction, dit-on assez bas, c'est tant pis à faire. What followed that night was not a romantic moment between husband and wife. It was something closer to a medical consultation. Ferdinand's private physicians had to be summoned to the chamber to explain, clinically and gently, what would be required of the princess in order to fulfill her duties as queen. The doctors tried to calm Maria Antonia, explaining that with the help of cushions, oils, and carefully timed positioning, consummation could be achieved without serious harm. But their words only added to her horror. This wasn't the future she had imagined. This wasn't love. It was fear, confusion, and humiliation wrapped in royal obligation. Under immense pressure from the court and her own family, Maria Antonia eventually submitted to the procedure. There was nothing tender about it. Servants were dismissed from the chamber, and physicians stood by behind the curtains in case their help was needed. No one spoke of what happened that night, but the change in the young queen was immediate. She became quiet, withdrawn, and visibly distressed. Her once lively spirit was gone. Her appetite faded. She began to suffer from headaches, nervous fits, and long periods of exhaustion. The court blamed everything from nerves to bad humors, but those closest to her knew the truth. She was traumatized. Ferdinand, meanwhile, grew frustrated and cold. He couldn't understand why his wife seemed so distant, so unwilling. In his mind, he had done everything necessary. Doctors had been consulted, preparations made. What more could be expected of him? But Ferdinand saw everything through the lens of his own shame. Maria Antonia's fear felt like rejection. Her silence felt like mockery. And over time, his resentment toward her grew. Their marriage, which had begun with hope and ceremony, had collapsed within weeks into quiet misery. Publicly, they played their roles. Privately, they barely spoke. For the rest of Maria Antonia's short life, she lived as a queen in name only, physically and emotionally isolated from the man she had been forced to call husband. The wedding night resumed, but it was anything but intimate. The custom cushions were arranged with care. Oils were applied, and what followed was less a moment of passion and more a clinical procedure, something closer to surgery than lovemaking. Private letters exchanged between court physicians, long hidden from public view, described the encounter as a scene of almost surreal dysfunction. Ferdinand had to rely on a specially designed pillow to support the weight of his enormous member, not just to avoid injuring Maria Antonia, but to prevent harming himself during intercourse. Even with all the equipment, the process was so overwhelming for Maria Antonia that she had to be given laudanum, a powerful opiate, just to endure it. The psychological impact on both of them was immediate and profound. For Ferdinand, the reaction he feared most, his wife's horror, had come true. Already deeply insecure and paranoid about his condition, Maria Antonia's visible revulsion shattered what little confidence he had left. It fed his darkest thoughts and twisted his emotions further. Maria Antonia, on the other hand, began to suffer from what we would now recognize as severe sexual trauma. She became frightened of physical closeness, withdrawn, and visibly shaken after each encounter. To cope, she began taking more and more laudanum, not for pain, but to numb herself emotionally. What began as a small dose to calm her nerves soon turned into full dependence. She used the drug not just to get through her marital duties, but to escape them entirely, retreating into a fog of sedation as her young life unraveled. The palace remained silent. No one dared speak the truth. But behind the doors of the royal bedchamber, a tragedy was unfolding. One rooted not just in politics or power, but in suffering, silence, and unthinkable personal pain. Their efforts to produce an heir soon turned into a ritualized nightmare, one that played out again and again with the same painful result. Each attempt followed a grim routine. Ferdinand would summon his physicians, who prepared the bedchamber with the necessary equipment, custom cushions, oils, and medical instruments. Maria Antonia would be given enough laudanum to make her compliant, though not unconscious. Then the procedure would begin, carried out with cold, clinical precision. There was no romance, no tenderness. Once it was over, both Ferdinand and Maria Antonia would retreat to opposite ends of the palace to recover, physically and emotionally, from the ordeal. As months turned into years with no pregnancy, Ferdinand's desperation turned into obsession. He became convinced that Maria Antonia's visible disgust was the reason they couldn't conceive. In his mind, her fear and reluctance were somehow blocking the process. Instead of recognizing the trauma they both endured, Ferdinand began blaming her, believing she was too emotionally weak, too feminine, as he put it, to fulfill her royal duty. Driven by this belief, he started experimenting with increasingly strange and disturbing methods to fix the problem. Court records, long buried but later uncovered, reveal that Ferdinand issued quiet orders for the creation of special. Ferdinand's frustration soon crossed a line. In a chilling development, he ordered the creation of restraints, devices meant to hold Maria Antonia in place during their intimate encounters, preventing her from pulling away or reacting with visible disgust. These restraints, made from fine leather and silk, were designed by the very same artisans who crafted the king's saddles and hunting gear. An unsettling overlap between violence, control, and royal ritual. But Ferdinand didn't stop there. He became obsessed with timing their efforts to conceive according to the stars. He consulted astrologers, astronomers, and even dabblers in darker arts, anyone who promised to shift fate in his favor. Lunar cycles were charted, celestial alignments tracked, and the palace quietly opened its doors to mystics, potion sellers, and spiritual frauds. Soon, the royal household became a strange crossroads between science and superstition. Fertility potions were brewed, magical amulets were worn. Elaborate rituals were performed in private chambers, each one claiming to overcome the curse of Ferdinand's deformed anatomy. One of the most desperate episodes came when Ferdinand met a self-proclaimed mystic who claimed to be from the Orient. This so-called wise man convinced the king that his misshapen organ was not a flaw, but a divine gift, the dragon's rod, as he called it. According to the mystic, Ferdinand was chosen and only needed the right ceremonies to unlock his full fertility power. For 3 months, Ferdinand and Maria Antonia were subjected to bizarre practices involving burning incense, chanting, and forced intimacy in strange, contorted positions supposedly taken from ancient Chinese manuscripts. And somehow, against all odds, Maria Antonia did conceive, twice. The entire court rejoiced. Ferdinand's confidence soared. For the first time, it seemed that all the rituals, remedies, and suffering might finally lead to the one thing Spain desperately needed, an heir. The palace buzzed with cautious hope. Nobles whispered prayers. The public held its breath. But both pregnancies ended in tragedy. Maria Antonia suffered two devastating miscarriages. The first came late into the second trimester, the second even earlier. In both cases, the emotional and physical toll on her was enormous. She was bedridden for weeks. Her health weakened further each time. These losses didn't just shatter her body, they crushed what little hope she had left. Ferdinand was enraged, not at fate, not at his condition, but at his wife. He blamed her for the miscarriages, convinced she hadn't tried hard enough to carry the child to term. He accused her of weakness, of failing in her sacred duty to Spain. But those closest to Maria Antonia knew the truth. Her body had been pushed to its limits. Years of trauma, repeated physical ordeals, laudanum addiction, and emotional distress had taken their toll. The pregnancies had been miracles, but her body simply couldn't carry them any further. And now, whatever fragile bond remained between husband and wife was finally broken. The royal couple emerged from the miscarriages more broken than ever. The first loss in 1804 occurred during the 4th month of pregnancy. Court physicians, careful with their language, said it was due to the unusual stresses placed upon Her Majesty's delicate constitution. But those who understood the situation knew the truth. They just couldn't say it aloud. The trauma of intercourse with Ferdinand, whose anatomical deformity made every intimate encounter physically punishing, had simply been too much for Maria Antonia's body to endure. The second miscarriage, in 1805, was even more tragic. This time, Maria Antonia carried the child almost to full term. But the labor was so violent, so prolonged and bloody, that it nearly killed her. She survived, but she was never the same again. After that, she became a shadow of the vibrant young woman who had once arrived in Madrid with dreams of love and royalty. Her addiction to laudanum worsened. She was sedated more often than not, drifting through the palace like a ghost, alive but barely present. And Ferdinand? His response exposed the worst parts of his character. Instead of showing compassion, he grew more suspicious, more cruel. He convinced himself that Maria Antonia had caused the miscarriages on purpose. He accused her of secretly taking herbs to end her pregnancies, of moving or walking in ways that would provoke a loss, even of secretly supporting liberal political ideas that made her unwilling to provide Spain with a proper Catholic heir. These accusations, whispered throughout the palace corridors, weren't just damaging, they were devastating. What little remained of Maria Antonia's mental health crumbled in those final months. She began to believe she truly was cursed, that something inside her was rejecting Ferdinand's seed as punishment for a sin she couldn't name. Racked with guilt and confusion, she spent her last days in near constant prayer, begging for forgiveness for imagined crimes and hidden shames she had never committed. When she died in May 1807, at just 21 years old, the official cause of death was recorded as fever and complications due to her delicate constitution. But the truth was far more tragic. Maria Antonia didn't die from illness. She died from despair. Years of sexual trauma, psychological torment, drug dependence, and emotional isolation had destroyed her from the inside out. By the end, her body had given up, long after her spirit already had. Yet even in death, she could not escape the dark, twisted world that surrounded Ferdinand. Rumors began to spread almost immediately. Some whispered that she hadn't died naturally at all, that she had been poisoned, not by enemies of the crown, but by Ferdinand himself. The theory was horrifying, that the king, tired of Maria Antonia's failures as a wife and queen, had arranged her death to make way for a new bride, one who might succeed where she had not. The gossip only intensified after the sudden and suspicious death of the palace apothecary, just days after the queen's passing. He was found dead in his chambers under unknown circumstances. Most troubling of all, he had reportedly left behind a letter, said to contain a final confession or vital secrets. That letter was immediately seized by Ferdinand's agents and never seen again. Some said it detailed poisons secretly administered to the queen. Others believed it contained shocking information about Ferdinand's own medical condition and the impossible demands he placed on his wife behind closed doors. Ferdinand's behavior after Maria Antonia's death didn't help quiet the rumors. While he made all the expected public gestures of mourning, black clothing, solemn processions, formal masses, those close to him saw a very different man behind palace doors. Privately, Ferdinand seemed almost relieved by Maria Antonia's death. Within weeks, he was already making inquiries about a second wife. This time, he focused on candidates with a proven ability to bear children, widows or noblewomen who had already produced offspring in earlier marriages. Fertility, above all else, was now the priority. Meanwhile, his physicians were scrambling. If Ferdinand was to remarry and avoid another disaster, they had to find a way to make intercourse less traumatic for his future bride. What followed was one of the strangest and most disturbing chapters in royal medical history. Doctors began experimenting with increasingly bizarre and complex marital aids, hoping to find a design that could accommodate Ferdinand's condition while minimizing harm to his partner. At the same time, they explored early surgical techniques that might physically reshape his anatomy, though such procedures were dangerous and barely understood at the time. These efforts pushed the limits of 19th century medicine and raised more questions than they answered. But the damage had already been done. By the time Ferdinand approached his second marriage, his personality had changed in deeply unsettling ways. The trauma and humiliation of his first union, combined with years of fear, rejection, and obsession, had hardened him. He had grown into a man incapable of real empathy or emotional connection. The shame he once tried to hide had twisted into cruelty. Ferdinand no longer saw the people around him as individuals with their own feelings or humanity. He viewed them as tools, to be used for his benefit, or obstacles to be removed if they stood in his way. This mindset would come to define his reign and help earn him a place in history as one of Spain's most reviled monarchs. His second marriage, to Maria Isabel of Portugal in 1816, was entered into with cold determination rather than any sense of love or companionship. She was young, healthy, and most importantly, had already shown signs of fertility in her family line. That alone made her suitable in Ferdinand's eyes. The court put on a grand show. The wedding was lavish. The public celebrated, desperate for hope after years of instability and mourning. But behind the palace walls, nothing had changed. The medical preparations resumed. The custom cushions were pulled out of storage. New versions of the restraints were fitted. Potions and tonics were lined up by the king's bedside. Maria Isabel, like her predecessor, was unprepared for the reality of married life with Ferdinand. And yet, despite everything, she did become pregnant, not once, but several times. This time, the pregnancies held. For a brief moment, it looked as if Ferdinand's long-awaited dream of producing an heir might finally be realized. But the emotional damage he carried and the abusive, detached way he treated his wives never disappeared. His obsession with producing children was not rooted in love or legacy, but in power, pride, and personal validation. He wasn't interested in building a family. He was trying to prove to the world and to himself that he was not broken. Maria Isabel gave birth to several children, but not all survived. The palace celebrated the births publicly, but the private cost remained heavy. The queen, like Maria Antonia before her, became more and more withdrawn over time. While she never suffered the same tragic end, her spirit dimmed under the constant weight of Ferdinand's control and obsession. By now, the man who once hoped for redemption through fatherhood had fully transformed into a monarch driven by suspicion, cruelty, and emotional isolation. The trauma of his youth, the paranoia of his court, and the monstrous demands he placed on those around him all converged into a reign defined by fear. And it had all started with a curse written not by fate or politics, but in his very flesh. Ferdinand's worldview had become completely transactional. His first wife, in his mind, had been a tool, one that didn't work and was therefore discarded. His subjects were tools for preserving his authority and feeding his ego. Anyone who stood in his way, no matter how minor the offense, was no longer a person, but a threat that had to be eliminated. Those closest to him, especially palace staff, began to see signs of something darker. His growing sadism started to show in the way he exercised power. He issued cruel and irrational commands just to test obedience. Servants who accidentally caught a glimpse of him unclothed weren't merely fired. They disappeared altogether, violently and permanently. Guards who failed to keep absolute silence about the goings-on inside the royal chambers were reassigned to the most dangerous and remote frontier posts in Spain's crumbling empire. It was punishment disguised as procedure. Ferdinand also became obsessed with the idea that people were mocking him behind his back, and it wasn't entirely imagined. People were whispering about his condition, his failed marriage, the bizarre rituals. But Ferdinand's reaction went far beyond reason. He kept secret lists of those he suspected of laughing at him. He fantasized about revenge. He even sketched out scenarios, detailed, brutal plans he intended to carry out once he had enough power. By 1807, Ferdinand had become the figurehead of a brewing conspiracy. Some of Spain's top nobles and military commanders, disillusioned by the weak rule of Charles IV and the widely hated influence of Prime Minister Manuel de Godoy, saw the prince as their chance for a new direction. But what they didn't realize was that they were placing their hopes in a man who was not just politically ambitious, but deeply unstable. Ferdinand's sexual trauma and lifelong physical shame had twisted his personality in ways no one fully understood. The man they were elevating to power wasn't just angry at his father's failures. He was fueled by decades of private humiliation and now saw power not as responsibility but as vengeance. They thought they were replacing incompetence. What they were actually creating was something far more dangerous. The conspirateurs who backed Ferdinand called themselves the Fernandinos. They worked relentlessly to build up his public image, branding him as El Deseado, the desired one. Through carefully crafted propaganda, they painted Ferdinand as a brilliant patriotic reformer. According to their narrative, he was the future king who would rescue Spain from decay and restore its former glory. They spoke of his intelligence, his strength, and his commitment to the Spanish people. But behind closed doors, they knew better. Those closest to him were becoming increasingly aware of his erratic behavior, violent mood swings, and disturbing treatment of anyone who challenged or embarrassed him. Still, they pressed forward, believing they could control him or at least use him for their own ends. Everything came to a head in October 1807 with what became known as the El Escorial conspiracy. Ferdinand was caught plotting to overthrow his own father, King Charles IV, with the help of none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a bold and reckless move, but when the plot was uncovered, Ferdinand's response shocked even his allies. Faced with consequences, he panicked. Rather than defending his actions or protecting the men who had risked everything to support him, Ferdinand immediately betrayed them all. He confessed to everything. Every meeting, every message, every name. He handed over a full list of his co-conspirators to his father and mother, begging for their forgiveness in a groveling letter. While his supporters were thrown into prison, forced into exile, or disgraced at court, Ferdinand walked away, untouched. This cowardly betrayal revealed a disturbing truth about Ferdinand. He had no loyalty to anyone, not to his friends, not to his allies, and certainly not to the ideals he pretended to champion. It was the beginning of a pattern that would come to define his entire reign. Self-preservation at all costs, no matter who had to suffer for it. Ferdinand's pattern was now unmistakable. Use people for his own gain, then discard or destroy them the moment they were no longer useful. Even as his political maneuvering intensified, his medical condition continued to deteriorate. Court physicians observed disturbing changes. His member, already grotesquely oversized and misshapen, was still growing, its shape becoming even more irregular over time, with new abnormalities that made physical intimacy increasingly difficult. Some modern medical historians believe he may have suffered from a rare hormonal disorder known as macrogenitosomia, referred to in older records as megalois, a condition that causes excessive and abnormal growth of male genitalia throughout adulthood. While this diagnosis remains speculative, the symptoms described in historical accounts align closely with the disorder. Whatever the exact cause, the reality at the time was painfully clear. Ferdinand's condition was worsening, and any chance of producing an heir would now require not only more advanced tools and interventions, but wives who were willing or forced to endure it. And so one of the darkest elements of his later reign emerged. Ferdinand began selecting wives not for love, alliance, or even their royal bloodlines, but for their psychological vulnerability. He chose women who could be controlled, manipulated, or physically coerced into submitting to his increasingly extreme sexual requirements. This wasn't about romance or duty anymore. It was about domination, survival, and control. Ferdinand had become a man so consumed by his shame, paranoia, and ambition that he saw human relationships not as partnerships, but as means to an end. His need for an heir had become an obsession, and everything else, including his wife's well-being, became expendable in the pursuit of that goal. Behind closed doors, the palace craftsmen had taken on a grim new role. They had become specialists in designing increasingly elaborate and disturbing marital equipment. Hidden in the deepest chambers of the royal residence, their workshops bore little resemblance to traditional tailoring or upholstery rooms. Instead, they looked like a strange fusion of medical laboratory and torture chamber. Their task was clear: create tools that would make Ferdinand's sexual encounters physically possible while minimizing the damage to his partners. They designed adjustable cushions, restraining devices, and a variety of strange custom-made implements, all crafted to accommodate the king's grotesquely deformed anatomy. Every item was tailored with disturbing precision, not for comfort, but for control and damage limitation. These craftsmen were bound by strict oaths of secrecy, and Ferdinand ensured their silence in two ways: with generous pay and with fear. Whispers spread through the palace over time. Several artisans involved in the production of these devices were later found dead under mysterious circumstances. Official causes were vague: accidents, illness, disappearances. But those close to the court suspected the truth. Ferdinand had them silenced permanently to keep his secret from ever being exposed. Then, in 1808, everything changed. Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain and forced Ferdinand to abdicate the throne. Suddenly, the man who had spent his life hiding behind royal power found himself stripped of authority and exposed. But for Ferdinand, this wasn't just a political defeat. It was a uniquely personal and humiliating moment. When Napoleon invaded and forced Ferdinand to abdicate in 1808, it wasn't just the fall of a monarch. It was the unraveling of a man whose entire life had been built around control, secrecy, and fear. Ferdinand found himself held as a political prisoner in France, first in Bayonne and later at the Château de Valenciennes. The desired one, who had been propped up as Spain's savior, was now powerless, humiliated, and isolated, stripped of his throne and surrounded by foreign guards who owed him no loyalty and had no reason to protect his secrets. There are scattered records, letters, second-hand accounts from diplomats that suggest Ferdinand's physical condition became a subject of fascination and quiet mockery among some members of the French court. No longer protected by the tight web of palace secrecy, the bizarre rumors that had surged into silence or sudden fits of rage. Without the familiar rituals, equipment, and staff who had carefully managed his private life for decades, Ferdinand began to unravel emotionally. He was no longer a king commanding loyalty through fear. He was a man imprisoned by his own body, his own mind, and his inability to function in the world without a controlled environment. And yet, even in exile, Ferdinand remained obsessed with reclaiming the throne. Letters he wrote during his captivity reveal a man still clinging to fantasies of redemption and power, still convinced that Spain needed him, still unwilling to confront the reality of what he had become. When Napoleon finally allowed him to return to Spain in 1814, Ferdinand came back not humbled, but hardened. Whatever humanity might have remained in him had been extinguished by those years of ice. He returned not as a reformer or savior, but as a ruler fueled by revenge, driven by paranoia, and determined to crush anyone who had ever questioned his rule. Ferdinand hadn't just lost his throne, he had become a prisoner. And worse still, his captors likely knew everything about the shame he had spent his life hiding. French intelligence had kept detailed records on the Spanish royal family, and it's almost certain that Ferdinand's anatomical abnormality was among the private information they had quietly collected. Now in French custody, his most intimate secret was no longer protected. During the 6 years he spent imprisoned at the Château de Valençay, Ferdinand became the subject of intense medical interest. French physicians, freed from the royal decorum and tight restrictions that had bound their Spanish counterparts, approached his condition not with discretion, but with cold, scientific curiosity. What followed were medical examinations so invasive and relentless that they bordered on torture. These doctors weren't bound by loyalty or fear. They treated him not as a monarch, but as a rare specimen, a man whose body defied normal classification. Centuries later, reports from Napoleonic archives would confirm the full extent of these examinations. French medical notes described a sexual organ of such immense size and unnatural shape that it seemed more fitting for a creature from legend than for a human being. The French theorized that Ferdinand's condition wasn't caused by a single illness, but by the convergence of multiple genetic disorders. They referred to it as a perfect storm of anatomical malfunction, a result of generations of inbreeding compounded by an already fragile genetic line. And while these clinical assessments were being made in private chambers, something very different was happening across Spain. Back home, brave men were dying, fighting in trenches, resisting French forces in mountain passes, risking everything to restore Ferdinand to the throne. The irony was staggering. While patriots gave their lives for him, Ferdinand spent his exile consumed by a different kind of battle, one entirely personal and self-absorbed. He used his time in captivity not to reflect, not to grow, but to obsess over his private affliction. Dozens of handwritten letters from this period reveal his true focus, not the suffering of his people, not the war, not the rebuilding of a fractured nation, but his quest to find a new bride. He reached out to royal families across Europe, proposing marriage to princesses and noblewomen, some as young as their teens, offering vague explanations of his special circumstances, and promising that his condition could be managed with the proper understanding. The letters show a man completely detached from reality. While Spain bled for him, Ferdinand remained locked in a private world of shame, obsession, and desperation, determined to pass on his cursed legacy, no matter the cost. While Spain was still in chaos, Ferdinand had his mind on something else entirely: his next wedding night. When he returned to Spain in 1814, the public reaction was overwhelming. People flooded the streets to welcome him. They cried with joy, tossed flowers in the air, and knelt as his carriage rolled by. Children who had only heard stories about him finally saw the man their parents had died fighting to bring back. Even the streets of Madrid felt alive with celebration. Ferdinand smiled and waved, playing the part of the returning king, But inside, his thoughts were elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about rebuilding the country or thanking the people who had risked everything for him. His top priority was to find a new wife, someone who at last might be able to give him the one thing he'd always wanted and never had, an heir. That same year, his reign began what historians now call the ominous decade. Most people remember this period for its harsh political crackdowns and rising authoritarian rule. But the real darkness came from something far more personal: Ferdinand's ongoing, increasingly strange attempts to father a child. His private medical struggles had become tightly tied to his failures as a ruler. What was once just a personal issue had grown into a national crisis. The king's inability to function normally in his own marriage was now playing out across the entire country. One of his very first acts after reclaiming the throne wasn't about politics at all. Instead, he ordered a completely new set of intimate equipment. He wanted the best craftsmen in the world to help solve his private problem. He sent agents across Europe, Germany, Italy, even the Ottoman Empire, in search of specialists who could design custom devices for his specific condition. These artisans were told they were working on royal marital tools, but what they were really doing was helping Ferdinand manage a condition that had shaped and would continue to shape his rule over Spain. The custom-made collection of devices, tucked away in secret rooms deep inside the royal palace, was a disturbing showcase of twisted creativity. It was, without a doubt, the peak of what early 19th century craftsmanship could offer in terms of managing a royal's private affliction. Ferdinand's next bride was Maria Isabel of Portugal, yet another cousin in the long, tragic line of royal intermarriage that had plagued his family for generations. She was just 19 years old when she arrived at the Spanish court in 1816, carrying with her the quiet hopes that many young princesses had in these arranged royal unions. But whatever dreams she brought with her were about to collide with a reality no one could fully prepare her for. Though the court physicians had already briefed her ladies-in-waiting about the special preparations needed for the wedding night, nothing they said could have truly prepared Maria Isabel for what she was about to face. The wedding itself was an extravagant affair, over the top in every way, a spectacle of Baroque splendor designed to distract the public from the uncomfortable truth. Their king was desperate. His rule was faltering, and the pressure to produce an heir was now overwhelming. Ferdinand stood at l'altar wearing cloth of gold, his face tight with barely concealed nerves. Outwardly, he played the part of a confident king, but in reality, he had spent the days leading up to the ceremony in a state of increasing panic. He consulted everyone he could: physicians, alchemists, even a mysterious figure rumored to be an Ottoman expert in royal sexual matters. This man had arrived in Madrid under heavy secrecy, escorted through back corridors and hidden quarters, so no one outside the palace would know of his presence. Ferdinand was preparing not just for a marriage, but for another high-stakes attempt to defy nature, shame, and failure in the most private chamber of the monarchy. The wedding night was a complete disaster, one that left deep scars on both Ferdinand and Maria Isabel for the rest of their brief time together. Despite all the planning, the custom devices, and consultations with experts from across Europe, nothing could overcome the reality of Ferdinand's condition. His grotesquely deformed anatomy made intimacy nearly impossible, and what was meant to be a royal consummation turned into something horrific. The sounds that echoed through the palace that night weren't of love or passion. They were cries of real pain and fear. Servants who entered the chamber afterward found blood-stained sheets and overturned furniture. It was clear that what had taken place resembled something more like torture than a wedding night. Whatever innocence or hope Maria Isabel had brought with her vanished that evening. She never recovered. Court staff began noticing sudden changes in her behavior. She developed a stutter, flinched whenever Ferdinand came near, and began having what palace doctors at the time called hysterical episodes. But with today's knowledge, it's clear she was experiencing severe trauma. Her ladies-in-waiting later reported that she would wake up screaming from nightmares, shouting about a monster that haunted her dreams. Her fear was constant, and her mental state steadily declined. Ferdinand, rather than showing concern or remorse, saw her fear as a direct insult to his royal pride. His already deep-rooted paranoia spiraled further out of control. He became convinced that Maria Isabel was secretly working against him, that she was mocking him, possibly even in league with foreign governments. He ordered her letters to be intercepted and read, had her meals tested for poison, and demanded her private chambers be searched regularly for signs of treason. What began as a private, deeply personal medical issue had now spread like a disease into every part of his leadership. Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction had evolved into full-blown political madness, one that poisoned not only his marriage, but his reign itself. The pressure to produce an heir had now become more than a royal duty. It was an all-consuming obsession that gripped both Ferdinand, Maria Isabel, and the entire Spanish court. Determined to succeed where he had failed before, Ferdinand ordered a series of strange and desperate medical consultations. He brought together not just doctors and anatomists, but even circus performers who claimed to have experience handling rare anatomical conditions. The royal bedchamber, once meant to be a private and sacred space, was turned into something resembling a testing lab. It became the center of a disturbing campaign of sexual experimentation where dignity was discarded in favor of increasingly extreme methods. One of the most unsettling accounts of this period comes from a private diary kept by a court physician who served during these years. He described a moment when Ferdinand, driven by sheer desperation, invited foreign experts to witness his attempts to conceive. German anatomists and French physicians were brought into the palace, not just to consult, but to observe firsthand. The king allowed these men to watch his most private moments, hoping their outside expertise would lead to some kind of breakthrough. It didn't. Instead, they took notes. They made detailed sketches, and those documents, cold, clinical, and deeply invasive, eventually made their way into medical schools across Europe. Ferdinand's most personal struggle was now the subject of anatomy lectures and university discussions, turning his pain into public curiosity. Maria Isabel, forced to endure this ongoing nightmare, began to break down. She stopped eating properly and lost a dangerous amount of weight. Her emotional outbursts were replaced by a hollow, vacant look in her eyes, a 1,000-yard stare, as one servant described it. That expression, frozen and empty, unsettled the palace staff more than any of her previous breakdowns. The young queen, once full of hope, was slipping away, and no one in power seemed willing to stop it. Maria Isabel had become a shadow of herself, barely speaking, barely eating. She wandered the palace like a ghost, trapped in a life she could no longer bear. The once hopeful young queen now lived in silence, her body present but her spirit long gone. The royal residence, meant to be a place of splendor and power, had turned into her personal prison. But the consequences of Ferdinand's private failures were no longer just personal. They were now having a major impact on Spain's political future. Across the Atlantic, Spain's colony, already in rebellion, began using Ferdinand's inability to father a child as proof that his family no longer held divine favor. Revolutionary leaders in places like Mexico and Argentina pointed to his lack of heirs as a symbol of the Bourbon dynasty's decline. They argued that a king who couldn't manage his own household had no right to rule over nations. In pamphlets, posters, and speeches, Ferdinand was portrayed as both sexually and politically useless, a tyrant whose physical defects reflected the collapse of his power. Ferdinand's reaction was as expected, paranoid and violent. He launched a harsh new wave of purges, targeting anyone accused of spreading rumors about his condition or supporting colonial revolts. The Inquisition, which he had revived after regaining the throne, was now investigating people not just for heresy, but for sexual slander against the crown. In this climate of fear, even a private joke between husband and wife could lead to arrest. People were imprisoned, or worse, for simply whispering about the king's problems. Ferdinand's obsession with secrecy became so extreme that he ordered new hidden passageways built inside the palace. These private corridors allowed him to move between his rooms and Maria Isabel's without being seen by servants. He feared mockery, even in silence, even from behind closed doors. His fear of humiliation was no longer just a personal burden. It had become a national crisis. Ferdinand's obsession with secrecy reached new extremes. He had mirrors installed at carefully chosen angles throughout the palace to catch potential eavesdroppers. A special network of spies was assigned to monitor gossip inside the palace, specifically anything related to his marriage or his physical condition. While the king tightened his grip on control, Maria Isabel's health kept getting worse. The physical abuse and constant emotional pressure were breaking her down completely. Palace doctors began reporting that she was experiencing what they called phantom pregnancies, times when her body showed signs of pregnancy even though conception was medically impossible. These episodes seemed to give Ferdinand brief moments of hope, only for reality to crush him again when it became clear there was no child. Within the walls of the palace, these false alarms became a grim joke. Staff whispered behind closed doors about how the king would pace nervously outside her chamber, praying one moment, then cursing the next, desperate for a miracle to fix what no amount of prayer or control could. Each time one of these phantom pregnancies ended, Ferdinand fell into deep depressions. For weeks afterward, the affairs of government would grind to a halt as the king retreated into despair. By 1818, after 2 years of a marriage marked by trauma, silence, and humiliation, Maria Isabel finally found her escape, the only one left to royal women at the time: death. The official cause given by palace physicians was nervous exhaustion, but letters written by household staff tell a different story, one of unending abuse, mental collapse, and a young queen who had been pushed far beyond her limits. There were quiet whispers among palace staff that Maria Isabel may have played a part in her own decline, engaging in small, discreet acts of self-harm to bring her suffering to an end. Her final words, recorded by her confessor, were a quiet prayer, thanking God for the release she believed death would soon bring. Ferdinand's response to her passing showed just how far his mental state had unraveled. Rather than grieving, he immediately assumed foul play. He became convinced that enemies of the crown had murdered her to stop him from fathering an heir. He ordered multiple autopsies, demanding that different physicians examine the body to search for traces of poison. When no clear cause was found, his suspicion turned toward those closest to her. Several of Maria Isabel's ladies-in-waiting were arrested and interrogated on charges of conspiracy. Ferdinand's grief was twisted by paranoia. The more he mourned, the more he raged. The result was a spiral of fear and accusation that affected everyone near the throne. Even Queen Isabel's funeral, what should have been a solemn and respectful farewell, turned into something horrific. The event became a dark spectacle, marked by heavy security, whispered accusations, and cold ceremonial displays that disturbed even Ferdinand's most loyal supporters. What should have been a time for mourning only deepened the atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and emotional collapse surrounding the king, and made it clear to everyone that his grip on reality was slipping further with each passing day. Ferdinand's behavior following Maria Isabel's death continued to disturb even those closest to him. He insisted on seeing her body several times while it was being prepared for burial. Witnesses reported him touching the corpse and quietly murmuring about her wasted womb, grieving not the woman herself, but the heir she never gave him. He commissioned a death mask of Maria Isabel's face and had it placed in his private chambers. Visitors later said they saw him speaking to it, as if carrying on conversations with the lifeless face of his late wife. But despite his strange mourning rituals, Ferdinand's mission to produce an heir could not be put on hold. Just months after Maria Isabel was buried, his advisors resumed negotiations for a third marriage. This time, the search for a bride proved especially difficult. Word had spread across European courts about the fates of Ferdinand's previous wives and his increasingly bizarre personal behavior. Several royal families pulled their daughters from consideration after discreet talks with doctors who had served at the Spanish court. Others agreed to consider the match only if strict conditions were met, like separate bedrooms, personal security staff, or full medical oversight. Ferdinand's intimate problems had become more than personal. They were now a diplomatic risk. His inability to maintain a healthy marriage or produce an heir was isolating Spain from potential allies. Eventually, the king's envoys found a match in Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony. Her family was in financial trouble, and their need for political and economic support outweighed their concerns about Ferdinand's disturbing reputation. Maria Josefa was 24 when she arrived in Madrid in 1819, older and more experienced than the young brides before her, but still carrying a quiet hope that maybe things would turn out differently. Her arrival was met with little fanfare. The wedding itself was much more modest than previous ones. There were fewer foreign dignitaries, less ceremony, and an air of quiet resignation. It felt like the entire court was simply going through the motions of a ritual that had already failed twice. Unlike Maria Isabel, Maria Josefa had come better prepared. Saxon doctors had fully briefed her on what to expect, and she brought her own set of medical instruments and remedies, along with a personal physician who specialized in managing challenging marital situations. She approached the marriage not with romance or hope, but with professionalism. For her, this wasn't love, it was a medical assignment. That clinical mindset allowed her to cope better than her predecessor. But even her discipline couldn't change the underlying truth. Ferdinand's condition made a successful marriage nearly impossible. The third marriage quickly settled into a cold, controlled routine. Attempts at intimacy were scheduled in advance, supervised by doctors, and carried out with the precision of a medical operation. Maria Josefa kept meticulous notes, recording times, methods, and outcomes like a scientist conducting an experiment. The royal bedchamber had become a treatment room, and the queen a reluctant participant in an ongoing clinical trial. Maria Josefa's calm, clinical approach, so different from the fear and panic of her predecessor, ended up frustrating Ferdinand even more. He became convinced that she didn't see him as a husband at all, but merely as a medical specimen. His paranoia grew worse. He began to suspect that Maria Josefa was secretly gathering information about his condition to send back to Saxony. Ferdinand ordered his spies to keep a close eye on her. They reported that she regularly wrote to her court physicians back home, sharing details of her health and her private life. To Ferdinand, this was more than personal betrayal, it was treason. He believed she was leaking what he saw as state secrets, the truth about his body. Meanwhile, the kingdom around him was crumbling. One by one, Spain's American colonies had broken away, Mexico, Argentina, Peru, and others, taking with them the wealth that had funded the empire for over 300 years. But Ferdinand was too distracted to respond. His obsession with his sexual struggles left him unable to lead effectively. When he was having a rough period in his marriage, cabinet meetings would be postponed. Major decisions were put on hold for weeks at a time while the king met with doctors, hoping for new treatments or advice on conception. His priorities were clear, and they had nothing to do with governing Spain. The people, who had once celebrated his return to the throne in 1814, now saw the reality of his rule. Anger and unrest were spreading. Uprisings brewed in cities. Armed gangs and bandits roamed the countryside. Food shortages and poverty became everyday realities for many. And while ordinary Spaniards went hungry, Ferdinand continued to pour money into bizarre medical procedures, sexual devices, and consultations with foreign experts. He was trying to fix a problem that no one could solve, while the country fell apart around him. Across Europe, Spain had become a joke, a former superpower reduced to chaos, led by a king whose private struggles had become public scandal. His failures in the bedroom had become symbolic of his failures on the throne. And yet, in 1829, after 10 long years of this strange clinical marriage, something unexpected happened. Maria Josefa, against all odds, achieved what many had believed was impossible. Maria Josefa became pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through the Spanish court and across all of Europe. Diplomats, nobles, and foreign observers scrambled to understand how Ferdinand had finally managed to overcome his well-known anatomical issues. Some claimed it was a miracle. Others pointed to new medical treatments. But the more cynical voices whispered darker theories, suggesting infidelity and raising quiet doubts about the child's legitimacy. Ferdinand's reaction was a chaotic mix of pure joy and overwhelming fear. He was ecstatic, but also terrified that something or someone would take this miracle from him. He immediately doubled Maria Josefa's security. More guards were assigned to her chambers, and the best doctors from across Europe were summoned to Madrid. He didn't stop there. Religious leaders from every major faith in the city were brought in to bless her rooms, her bed, and even her food. Ferdinand's obsession with protecting the pregnancy became almost manic. He convinced himself that enemies were plotting to harm the unborn child through dark magic, poisons, or scientific sabotage. At first, the pregnancy progressed without serious problems. But around the 7th month, Maria Josefa began experiencing troubling symptoms that her physicians struggled to explain. Based on modern medical understanding, it's likely she suffered from a placental abruption, a dangerous condition where the placenta separates from the uterus too early. With the right care, her condition might have been treated. But in Ferdinand's court, effective treatment was hard to come by. The king insisted on involving mystics, alchemists, and self-proclaimed miracle workers alongside licensed doctors. His interference created confusion, delays, and conflicting instructions, all of which made things worse instead of better. Then, on May 18, 1829, Maria Josefa went into early labor. The birth was a nightmare, one that left everyone in the room shaken. Ferdinand, despite having no medical training, insisted on being present and overseeing the entire process. He barked orders at the doctors, interrupted procedures, and refused to leave the room. The baby, a daughter, was born alive but extremely premature. She survived only a few hours before passing away due to complications that doctors simply couldn't manage with the limited knowledge and resources of the time. Maria Josefa survived the delivery, but she never regained her strength. 3 weeks later, she died from what was officially called childbed fever, but in reality, it was likely a mix of severe infection, physical exhaustion, and deep emotional despair. Ferdinand's response to this double loss was devastating and disturbing. He refused to let either his wife or his daughter be buried. He ordered court physicians to keep trying to bring them back, using increasingly bizarre methods. For nearly a week, the royal palace was filled with the unbearable smell of death. Staff members walked through the halls in silence and fear as the king demanded the impossible, resurrections. Eventually, he had to accept the truth. His wife and daughter were gone. When that moment came, it broke him. Ferdinand withdrew from the world completely. He stopped eating. He refused to speak to his ministers. He spent his days alone, surrounded by the death masks of all 3 of his wives, silent faces that watched over a king who no longer seemed alive himself. Spain, already falling apart, was now truly leaderless, and yet, fate wasn't finished with Ferdinand VII. In a final twist, the king, who had spent most of his adult life unable to produce a living heir, now faced the possibility of a 4th marriage. It was 1829. Ferdinand was 45 years old, emotionally shattered, and physically declining. But his advisors were desperate. The country was collapsing, and they believed that a new queen might help restore some sense of order. They had found a candidate, Maria Cristina of Naples. Here's the rewritten version of your passage, crafted to be easy to read, emotionally engaging, and fully human in tone, while preserving every key detail, number, and character name with spelling corrections like Ferdinand and Maria Cristina. What no one told Ferdinand, at least not until after the wedding arrangements were finalized, was that Maria Cristina was already pregnant by another man when she arrived in Madrid. The fourth royal wedding, held in 1829, was nothing short of a farce. It fooled no one. Maria Cristina was clearly pregnant as she walked down the aisle, and it was obvious to everyone in the court that the child she carried could not be Ferdinand's. But the king, desperate beyond reason for an heir, chose to believe, or at least to pretend, that this was a divine gift. In his mind, maybe this child was a miracle after all, even if it came through unconventional means. In 1830, Maria Cristina gave birth to a daughter, Isabella II. That moment should have been the end of Ferdinand's long and painful search for a successor, but instead it opened the door to a whole new wave of anxiety. Ferdinand knew full well that the baby wasn't his biological child, but he also knew he had to maintain the illusion of legitimacy. His dynasty and the fragile political stability of Spain depended on it. So, he went along with the lie. Maria Cristina and Ferdinand's relation was based on mutual deception. She acted like the loyal, dutiful queen. He pretended that Isabella was truly his. In truth, there was no trust, only a shared interest in maintaining appearances. Ferdinand's sexual problems, which had defined nearly his entire adult life, didn't go away in his final years. If anything, the pressure to produce a true biological heir only made things worse. He continued trying to father another child with Maria Cristina, hoping that this time it would really be his. The attempts were pitiful, medicalized, monitored, and increasingly hopeless as his body aged and his health declined. As the years dragged on, Ferdinand's paranoia grew darker and more unpredictable. He began conducting surprise inspections of Maria Cristina's rooms at all hours of the night. Armed guards would follow him as he burst through doors, convinced he would catch her in some act of betrayal. These sudden raids terrified her attendants. They never knew when the king might appear, wide-eyed and shaking, shouting about plots and conspiracies. Ferdinand's obsession with surveillance became truly disturbing. He had peepholes installed in the walls between his chambers and Maria Cristina's. Servants sometimes saw the king's eye peering through these tiny openings, watching the queen's most private moments, when she was feeding their daughter, praying, or simply sitting in silence. He watched everything. Maria Cristina knew she was constantly being watched. She began moving carefully through her own rooms, acting like a prisoner. Every glance, every gesture was measured, controlled. She knew that even the smallest movement could be misinterpreted by the king. Even meals became acts of suspicion. Ferdinand demanded that all of the queen's food be tested in front of him. And not just tasted, he insisted that testers wait a full 30 minutes after sampling before the dish was served, just in case any poison had a delayed effect. The king kept a close eye on his food tasters, watching them with the sharp focus of a hunter watching its prey. He stared at their faces, looking for the slightest sign of discomfort that might suggest poisoning. The pressure was so intense that several tasters collapsed from sheer nervous exhaustion. But instead of calming Ferdinand, these incidents only confirmed his growing belief that someone was trying to kill him. Maria Cristina, caught in this atmosphere of suspicion and fear, began to show the same signs of psychological strain that had destroyed his earlier wives. Her letters to her family in Naples secretly opened and read by the king's spies, revealed a woman slowly unraveling. She described feeling watched at all times, flinching at every sound, and losing trust even in the servants closest to her. She said her life felt like it was being lived inside a glass box, where even her breathing was being judged for signs of disloyalty. Ferdinand paranoia didn't stop with his wife. It spread across the entire royal court. He began changing his personal guards every single day, convinced that any man serving too long would eventually be turned by enemy forces. His cabinet ministers were subjected to ridiculous loyalty tests. In private meetings, Ferdinand would deliberately say things that contradicted previous orders, just to see who dared correct him. Anyone who did was instantly labeled a traitor. What had once been one of Europe's most refined courts turned into a place of silent fear and constant surveillance. Courtiers learned to speak in vague terms and avoid eye contact with the king. They walked on eggshells as if every step and word might be used against them. Conversations were whispered. Friendships ended and new alliances formed based not on trust, but on who seemed safest to be seen with. Everyone knew that saying the wrong thing, even in private, could mean arrest, exile, or worse. Even Ferdinand's bond with his baby daughter Isabella was poisoned by his obsessions. Though he knew she wasn't his biological child, he was torn between loving her as his heir and hating her as a reminder of his failure to father a child himself. He would sit for hours just staring at her, examining every feature, looking for some resemblance to himself or signs of the man who had truly fathered her. He even hired artists to paint detailed portraits of Isabella as she grew. He then compared these paintings side by side with portraits of himself and with images of Maria Christina's suspected past lovers. Her face became an obsession for him, a silent accusation he could never escape. The question of Isabella's paternity tormented Ferdinand more than anything else. In a cruel twist, the very child who would one day inherit the Spanish throne stood as living proof of his deepest failure. She would rule Spain not because he had succeeded, but because he hadn't. Ferdinand was painfully aware of the cruel irony in his situation. His greatest political victory, securing the royal succession, was also his most painful personal failure. This contradiction ate away at him like a slow-acting poison, tainting even the few moments of genuine affection he had with his daughter, Isabella. Desperate for reassurance, the king began consulting genealogists and physicians, hoping that science could somehow prove Isabella was truly his. These experts, fully aware of the danger they were in, gave him carefully worded, vague reports, statements that could be read however Ferdinand wanted. The original documents, still stored in palace archives, show just how far these scholars stretched their imaginations in a desperate effort to satisfy a king without risking their own heads. Ferdinand's obsession with control didn't stop there. He became even more intrusive in managing his wife's life. He assigned certain servants to watch over Maria Christina's private letters, instructing them to report not just what she wrote, but also the expressions on her face while she wrote it. He wanted full reports of her daily routine, how long she spent praying, what books she was reading, and which nobles she interacted with at court events. Living under this level of control was emotionally exhausting, but Maria Christina worked hard to keep up appearances. She learned to separate her public role from her private suffering, maintaining a calm and composed image while silently enduring the stress. It wasn't until centuries later, when her hidden diary was found behind a false wall in her chambers, that the full impact of her mental state came to light. In those private pages, she described what it felt like to live under Ferdinand's constant watch. "I feel like an actress," she wrote, "who must never break character, not even in my dreams. Ferdinand, grand paranoïa, n'a pas eu créé des problèmes dans la palace. Il a commencé à déplacer partie des pays étrangers, les ambassadeurs des autres pays en reportant des revenus bancaires autourtés. Ce qui m'énervait, d'autres puissants européens, cela a dit. On parlait de former des alliances troacti avec traité au roi d'affaires, une épande successée est tout à fait, could be trusted to hold up its end of any long-term agreements. What began as a personal issue was quickly turning into a diplomatic concern. The king became so obsessed with the idea that someone was out to kill him that he started seeing threats everywhere. When Maria Cristina asked to redecorate her rooms, Ferdinand immediately suspected she was trying to build secret compartments to hide weapons or poison. If someone at court said something kind about the queen's appearance, the king didn't see it as a compliment. He feared it was coded language for treason. Even her acts of worship raised red flags. He questioned whether her prayers were sincere or if they were somehow part of a plot involving foreign Catholic powers. All this paranoia came at an enormous cost. Spain was already in a deep financial hole, but Ferdinand's obsession with security only made things worse. He poured massive amounts of money into secret police, personal spies, and endless loyalty checks. He had new secret corridors built throughout the palace, set up complex alarm systems, and kept multiple groups of tasters, guards, and attendants, believing that spreading out these duties would prevent any one group from organizing against him. Meanwhile, the country's economy kept sliding further into crisis, and ordinary people were left to suffer. Ferdinand's own health began to break down under the constant pressure. Royal doctors observed that he couldn't sleep, had frequent stomach problems, and was always tense and restless. His paranoia had created a vicious cycle. His fear led to more extreme behavior. And that behavior only fed his fears. He was trapped in a downward spiral of anxiety and mistrust. Even his relationships with his own family started to crumble. Ferdinand began viewing his relatives with suspicion, convinced that even casual conversations or family visits were part of secret plots. What should have been joyful occasions, like birthdays, turned into stiff, uncomfortable events where everyone was afraid to speak too freely, worried that the king might misinterpret something and lash out. Ferdinand had become so paranoid that he saw signs of betrayal everywhere, even in the way flowers were arranged or in the choice of birthday presents. No one was spared. Even his own brother, Don Carlos, who had stood by him through many difficult moments, was suddenly under suspicion and watched by spies. Maria Cristina tried her best to protect their daughter Isabella from the king's growing madness, but even this caused problems. Ferdinand began to believe that the queen's protective behavior meant she was preparing Isabella to one day rule on behalf of foreign powers. When Maria Cristina asked for private time with their daughter, he imagined that she was planting dangerous ideas in the girl's head. What should have been simple mother-daughter bonding became another battlefield in the king's imagined war against traitors. Mother-daughter bonding became another battlefield in the king's imagined war against traitors. The household staff, especially those who served the royal family directly, found themselves in an impossible position. They were expected to keep close watch over the queen and report everything she did, all while acting like loyal servants. The pressure drove many to nervous breakdowns, and people quit constantly, which only made things worse. The new servants didn't know the complicated rules or what would set the king off, and even small, innocent mistakes were enough to make Ferdinand suspicious all over again. The household staff, especially those who served the royal family directly, found themselves in an impossible position. They were expected to keep close watch over the queen and report everything she did, all while acting like loyal servants. The pressure drove many to nervous breakdowns, and people quit constantly, which only made things worse. The new servants didn't know the complicated rules or what would set the king off, and even small, innocent mistakes were enough to make Ferdinand suspicious all over again. Ferdinand's obsession with finding out who Isabella's real father was took a disturbing turn. He ordered investigations into every man Maria Cristina had known during her time in Naples. The king's investigators collected thick dossiers, looking at these men's physical traits to see if they matched Isabella's appearance. They even pulled old medical records, family backgrounds, and private letters, all in a desperate attempt to uncover the truth. The king's private quarters reflected the depth of his torment. His bedroom was filled with reminders of his failures, portraits of his 3 dead wives, medical tools that had never fixed his condition, and religious items he had prayed over, hoping for a miracle. People who were granted an audience with Ferdinand in that space described it as haunting, heavy with sadness and desperation. He would sit surrounded by the evidence of his suffering, trying to make decisions about Spain while stuck in his own world of pain and disappointment. Maria Cristina, under relentless psychological strain, began to show visible signs of collapse. Her hair thinned, her weight changed dramatically, and she developed hand tremors she could barely control in public. Every moment in the palace became a balancing act between surviving her husband's scrutiny and protecting her daughter from it. Maria Cristina's ladies-in-waiting began noticing troubling changes in her behavior. She constantly looked over her shoulder, flinched at sudden noises, and seemed to live in a state of quiet fear. By 1832, Ferdinand's paranoia had reached such an extreme point that he truly believed his wife was trying to poison him, not through food or drink, but by simply touching him. Convinced that Maria Cristina was slipping toxin into his body through physical contact, Ferdinand demanded she undergo medical inspections before any form of intimacy. These humiliating exams were performed by court doctors while the king watched, reducing what little remained of their marriage to a series of degrading rituals. The rest of Europe was both horrified and fascinated by the spectacle unfolding in Madrid. Diplomatic letters from that time show that foreign governments had lost faith in Ferdinand's ability to rule. Many believed his mental state had made stable governance impossible. Behind the scenes, some countries even began quietly encouraging separatist movements in Spain, thinking it was better to see the Spanish Empire fall apart than continue under the rule of a king whose madness was now a matter of public record. As the year 1833 began, Ferdinand's body started to give out under the strain of years of stress, obsession, and paranoia. His doctors reported a constant tremor in his hands, ongoing stomach issues, and the first signs of what we would now call cognitive decline. His public speeches became disorganized and hard to follow, filled with accusations against invisible enemies and rambling mentions of plots that existed only in his mind. In the end, Ferdinand's death came quietly, almost without drama, after a life filled with chaos. After years of emotional torment, obsessive behavior, and physical suffering, his body finally gave up. He slipped in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling out for his long-dead wives, other times mumbling about conspiracies that had never existed. In 1833, Ferdinand VII finally found the peace he had never known in life through death. Officially, the cause was recorded as gout, but the truth was far more complex. His doctors knew the reality. He had died from sheer exhaustion, physical, mental, and emotional. His entire life had been a battle against his own body and mind, and that war had finally ended. The autopsy, conducted in secret by the same royal doctors who had spent decades trying to fix his condition, revealed the full scale of what Ferdinand had suffered. His penis, preserved for medical study, measured a shocking 14 inches in length, with irregular girth that confirmed what had long been whispered in palace halls. But that wasn't all. Inside, doctors found severe scarring and deformities that made normal intercourse practically impossible. Clear proof of why Ferdinand's efforts to produce an heir had ended in failure again and again. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Ferdinand had spent much of his life trying to fix his own body in secret. The doctors found signs of repeated self-surgery, clumsy, painful attempts made with whatever tools he could find, likely in total isolation. Instead of helping, these efforts had only worsened his condition, deepening both his physical pain and psychological trauma. It was a tragic glimpse into the king's private suffering, one that had remained hidden for decades. The preserved organ, along with medical sketches and detailed notes, was locked away in the Vatican archives. Church officials judged the material too disturbing and politically dangerous to ever be made public. Today, it remains one of the most unusual and unsettling secrets in European history. Scholars who've seen the records describe them as both scientifically fascinating and emotionally devastating. A raw window into the private agony of a king who ruled a nation while waging war against his own body. Ferdinand's death ended a reign that had damaged far more than himself. The crown passed to Isabella II, a daughter many suspected wasn't even his biological child. She inherited a broken country, torn apart by civil war, economic disaster, and international disgrace. The once mighty Spanish Empire had been reduced to a second-tier European power. Much of this collapse could be traced directly to the failures of a king whose personal struggles took priority over the needs of his people. Ferdinand VII's legacy stands as a chilling lesson. Power in the hands of the wrong person is dangerous, but power mixed with deep personal dysfunction is ruinous. His reign showed how one man's private torment could become a national nightmare, how deep psychological damage, when left unchecked, can bleed into public life and shape the fate of millions. His wives, his possibly illegitimate daughter, the people who suffered under his rule, and the kingdom he left in ruins. All were caught in the fallout of one man's unhealed wounds. And perhaps most painfully of all, Ferdinand himself was both the architect and the casualty of that disaster. He wasn't just a tyrant. He was also the victim of a broken system that gave absolute power to someone tragically unfit to handle it. As the royal physician in 1834 completed his strange and solemn task, preserving the king's most shameful legacy, he must have understood the full weight of what lay before him. This wasn't just a body. It was the symbol of a reign that had consumed everything in its path: queens, heirs, subjects, and finally, the king himself. The preserved organ was more than just a strange medical specimen. It stood as a grim symbol of what happens when shame turns into obsession, when power is left unchecked, and when a single man's private torment ends up wrecking an entire nation. In the end, Ferdinand VII did achieve une carte d'immortalité, mais pas le type qui la en veut. Son nom n'a pas vistori au parfait comme un sage ou un chef. Plutôt, ça vient un avertissement. Un tel de ce qui peut arriver quand la dysfonction personnelle est permis de passer à l'opinion. Son nom, le plus gardé, décia dans les vols cachés du Vatican. Attartir, dépenté au public. Ici est un remerciement pour la paix de quelques vérités que ne sont pas enseignées dans les livres d'histoire. Too raw to become myth, and too painful to be healed by time. The silk sheets that once tried to hide his deformities now stand as a symbol of a kingdom just as broken. Spain, left wounded and barely functioning, much like the king who ruled it. Ferdinand VII may have finally found peace in death, but the country he left behind would take generations to recover from the damage caused by his private nightmares and public failures. History would remember him not for greatness, but for the suffering he caused. The man who wanted to be remembered as a powerful monarch would instead be known as one of the most deeply troubled kings to ever sit on a throne. A ruler whose legacy was pain,